Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video. So I want to take a step back from DOS gaming today to discuss some of my other options for emulation, because it's getting increasingly harder to find good emulators, what with Windows 8 and 10's changes having ruined some of them from functioning as perfectly as they once did. Not to mention having to try and record these for streaming purposes. Thus, I'm going to be spending this video talking about my personal top emulator picks for the following systems: the Atari 2600, the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Super Nintendo, Sega Master System, Sega Genesis/Mega Drive, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance, and finally, the Game Gear. Now these are the systems I have the most experience emulating, thus why I'm focusing on these specifically. Now, ironically, I do prefer playing most of these with my actual hardware, but all of my consoles are in storage at the moment, and I don't have easy access to them. And while I do have all of my portables on hand, I don't have any of them modded for video capture. So I have quite a number of valid reasons for seeking emulation options. Not to mention, emulation in and of itself provides a means to explore how these games work, and has blown open the doors to understanding the inner secrets these old games have been holding back. And again, these are my personal emulation choices. Everyone's is going to be different, but I encourage you to check out each of the ones I talk about if you have an interest in emulating these systems, and I'll have links for acquiring these emulators in the video description. Also, for sake of fairness and to show some of the advanced features more accurately, each one is going to be running windowed relative to how big you can get it without aliasing on a 1920 by 1080 display. Now, let's kick things off with my Atari 2600 emulator of choice, Stella. The Stella emulator, named after the 2600's identical development code name, has been around for quite some time now, and has always been the emulator of choice for most everyone emulating the 2600. It supports practically all of the hardware and software ever created for the system, with very few exceptions, and emulates the real hardware as close to flawlessly as you could possibly expect, which, sure, the 2600 itself is a simple thing, but the TIA television interface adapter chip inside it for handling video? Not quite so simple. Those familiar with 2600 programming know just how ridiculous the limitations are. The most obvious one is that the 2600 itself only has 128 bytes of RAM. Not gigabytes, not megabytes, not even kilobytes, just 128 sets of 8 bits. Some of which could also be used as stack space by the CPU if the programmer wants to, but surprisingly few games really make use of that because there's a somewhat less obvious restriction that you typically don't realize just by watching the gameplay on screen. There's no frame buffer. The entire screen needs to be redrawn every single frame, and the data to draw on screen needs to be coded into existence in the tiny window of space within each horizontal sync. Yeah, not vertical sync, horizontal sync, as in the fraction of CPU time available before each individual scan line is drawn. When it comes down to it, the 2600 is all about timing, so making an emulator also means emulating the timing and synchronization of these chips perfectly. Anything less than perfect, and the emulation is just going to fall apart. This also makes Stella an invaluable tool for people doing homebrew development, especially given that it has a built-in debugger and disassembler, allowing you to check the state of RAM, registers, and even the state of the video, audio, and input. For play or for development, you can't go wrong with Stella. It started out as the best and has remained the best up to this day. Moving on to the NES, many people might think I'd choose Nestopia or FCEUX, as they're the two most common and highly ranked emulators. But nope, let me tell you about something even better, an emulator known as Messen. This is actually one of my more recent discoveries, as I was fed up with issues I was having with both Nestopia and FCEUX on the Windows 10 side of things. Messen has pretty much all the same features as those two emulators, combined, and then some. And on top of all of that, it's built specifically for accuracy, meaning its emulation of these old NES titles is virtually flawless. Now, just like with Stella, Messen features a fully functional and extremely detailed debugger and disassembler for people doing homebrew development, and includes a staggeringly large number of features for people who just want to play games. And one such feature I really like is the ability to custom set the strength of artificial scan lines as any desired value between 0% and 100%, which is good because I find even the lowest scan line settings in other emulators tend to be too strong. So I only have it set to 10%, and to me, that looks way better. Plus Plus, they're pixel-aligned, whereas with some emulators, the artificial scan lines are just overlaid over the rendered image and don't necessarily line up with the pixels. Meson also features a very powerful palette-altering utility, and one of the quirks of the NES is that its palette could look surprisingly different on different kinds of televisions. So not only can you load in custom palettes, it also includes several palettes by default, some of which are designed to emulate the default look of other popular emulators. Most importantly though, I have not had any technical issues with Meson at all. It just flat out works. Whereas Nestopia was giving me audio latency issues, and FCEUX was producing crackling audio and frame rate inconsistencies regardless of any settings I threw at it. Despite these emulators working perfectly fine back on Windows XP, Meson is definitely my emulator of choice for the NES side of things nowadays. For the Super Nintendo, there were two popular emulator choices originally, SNES 9X and ZSNES. And I used to be a ZSNES person as it had a much more snazzy interface and lots of configuration options, but over time, SNES 9X pulled ahead in terms of features, and now ZSNES barely functions properly at all on Windows 10 compared to SNES 9X. So I switched over to SNES 9X. I'm not 100% satisfied with this choice of emulator, but finding decent SNES emulators with the kinds of features I would want, which work properly on Windows 10, it's kind of difficult. Now, SNES 9X fills all the features that I want and only has very minor technical issues for me, occasionally producing very tiny stutters in the audio, but otherwise working flawlessly. Now, unlike the other two emulators we've seen so far, SNES 9X was designed for playing games, not developing them, so there's no debugging features here. But it does have plenty of other neat features to tie into everything, such as linking two instances over the internet for playing a two-player game with someone else remotely, which is, it's a feature ZSNES has as well. In fact, the features between SNES 9X and ZSNES are very similar. Though for some reason, I couldn't ever get the high-resolution Mode 7 graphics rendering working in SNES 9X. Unless it's simply not implemented yet in the version I'm using. It works fine in ZSNES. The accuracy of the emulation is also pretty good. I haven't spotted anything out of the ordinary in the games I play on this thing, but I haven't actually used it all that much lately. Most of my SNES game collection is long-playing games, and I just haven't had the time to sit down and play them. Though I have been streaming them on occasion without any major issues thus far. Still, if anyone has any other SNES emulator recommendations, feel free to leave them in the comments. In fact, feel free to leave any of your emulator recommendations in the comments. It'd be interesting to hear about what everyone else is using, which I may not be aware of. Just be careful you don't link to ROM download sites, cause those ones are gonna get filtered out. You win! Moving on to the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance, I don't actually have any perfect emulator for these. Now, every emulator I've used for emulation of these portables has some kind of shortcoming somewhere. So there's two emulators I typically flip-flop between depending on what I'm playing and why I'm playing it. The first is BGB, which is strictly for Game Boy and Game Boy Color emulation. Now, I need to point out right away that BGB does not take to being recorded very well, so some of the footage you may see may look a little choppy. Rest assured that's the video capture, even though it looks just fine to my eyes while I'm capturing it. BGB can also be kinda stubborn to configure properly, but the reason I like it is because it's highly accurate, not just in terms of the emulation itself, but also in terms of the audio. A lot of Game Boy emulators do not get the sound 100% perfect without latency or choppiness, but BGB does. Plus, I like that I can set the window size nice and large by default without having to worry about aliasing from trying to custom size it. BGB is annoying to get working, but excellent once you do have it working. My other emulator of choice, and the one I use for Game Boy Advance emulation, or for streaming since BGB doesn't like being captured, is Visual Boy Advance M, also known as VBAM. Visual Boy Advance used to be the emulator of choice for GBA emulation long ago, but also hasn't been updated in years. Thus, the VBAM project was started as a branch off of the VBA main branch, and has continued to receive updates to this day. Thus why it functions so much better than the original VBA on a modern Windows 10 system. Once again though, I'm not 100% satisfied with this emulator. For one thing, the largest you can set the window size automatically is only 4x, which, as you can see, is pretty small by comparison. Now you can manually make it bigger, but then you're liable to skew the sizes of the pixels, which can end up with aliasing artifacts, which just doesn't appeal to my eyes at all. VBAM also does have useful tools for the homebrew crowd, though it lacks a standard debugger in place of individual tools for analyzing the state of the game. Thus, using it from a homebrew perspective is doable, but your mileage may vary. And finally, for Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, and Game Gear emulation, all you need is one emulator: Fusion. The Kega Fusion emulator is actually pretty old by this point, and so it isn't the best emulator by any stretch of the imagination, if you want to do homebrew development or take advantage of advanced features similar to those we've seen in the other emulators. But for just playing games, having a single emulator solution that works virtually flawlessly for any hardware made by Sega predating the Saturn is extremely convenient. And despite its age, it does have some nifty features too. It has double and quad prescalers for keeping the pixels looking sharp if you prefer that over a more smooth scaler, as well as an overdrive option for the audio, which I've actually never fully understood. It makes the audio louder, but other than that, I don't really know what it's doing. It seamlessly flips between the various emulation options as well. Heck, part of the reason why Fusion is even possible without an insane amount of effort is because of how much hardware is actually shared between Sega's early consoles and portables. Heck, the Game Gear is almost identical in terms of chips and functionality to the Master System, save for having a larger color palette. In fact, I own the Master Gear Converter, which is literally just a pass-through to connect a Master System cart into a Game Gear, similar to the power-based converter for the Genesis, which again is just a pass-through to connect a Master System cart to the Genesis. But yeah, Fusion is very old by this point, and it amazes me that it still works as well as it does on Windows 10 despite its age. It's a good choice if all you want to do is play games, but for the developers amongst you, I can't imagine this is the emulator of choice, so feel free to comment on what you feel are good alternatives to Fusion. Anywho, that's it for my emulator choices. And there's many other systems I've experimented with emulating, although this covers almost all of my retro gaming collection, short of my ColecoVision and WonderSwan, which I don't have a large enough collection for to really bother with emulating. And maybe someday I'll go try to run the old Nesticle and Genesis emulators in DOSBox just for kicks, but quite frankly, they were never that great and were more so a stepping stone right at the forefront of the emulation craze starting in the late 90s. Now, granted, I'm not sure if I've ever explained this before or not, but I personally feel emulation serves an additional purpose beyond simply playing games, developing games, or discovering their secrets. And that's experimentation. What can you make the game do? What can you make the game look like? What kind of controls can you give the game which you couldn't before? To me, emulation is a means to make games play the way I want to play them, not necessarily that I'm trying to get them to play accurately. Sure, for the genuine experience, real hardware is the way to go, but gaming is more than the sum of its hardware, and enjoying software does not and should never be limited by the hardware it was originally intended for. It's a part of the reason why I push DOSBox as hard as I do, because it's a great tool for enjoying DOS games the way you want to enjoy them, without wrestling with the countless hardware configurations possible or necessary for getting those old games working. Anyways, that's all for today's filler. Ancient DOS Games episode 255 will be going up on Saturday, May 4th, and we're going to be taking a look at one of the key inspirations which led to the Elder Scrolls series. Yeah, freaking finally, so make sure you all stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random set of you guys.